All right, hello everybody, and welcome to Two Sides of the Same Coin, Renewable Energy Impacts on Biodiversity Conservation. My name is Molly Krozik, and I'm the Development and Membership Associate here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I help in leading the Emerging Leaders Initiative. We are so delighted that you all were able to join us today. So we will have time for questions throughout this program, so please enter your questions into GoTo's question box. And please don't wait until the end of the session. You are most welcome to send your questions as you think of them. So I would like to begin with introducing our moderator, Jim McElfish, Senior Attorney and Director of Sustainable Land Use Program here at ELI, where his research focuses on development choices and their links to land use, water resources, biological diversity, and infrastructure policy. I'll now turn it over to Jim to introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Molly, and welcome to all of you to this panel of renewable energy and biodiversity conservation. This is an area where we clearly want both of these things. We want to speed the transition to renewable energy for the benefit of the climate and public health, and we want to conserve biodiversity because of the richness of life it provides, the importance of all living creatures and their habitats, and we're confronted with a set of new challenges. In some ways, people have tried to set up the renewable energy transition as an obstacle to biodiversity conservation. But in fact, there are ways to accommodate and address both if we plan ahead. And our panel is going to talk about some of the approaches that we use to do that. As you know, that we have important national goals, international responsibilities, and local goals for both renewable energy and biodiversity conservation. We have International Convention on Conservation of Biodiversity, many international agreements. We have national commitments, endangered species, migratory birds, Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. We have many state requirements and goals. And we have in many of our local governments concern for being both nature friendly and dealing with climate impacts and renewable energy changes. Our topic today is framed to some degree by the Biden administration's announcement of a goal to conserve 30% of our nation's lands and marine waters for conservation purposes by 2030, and our renewable energy goals, stated in various ways at both the state and federal level, sometimes dealing with specific forms of energy, like the 30 by 30 2030 wind goal, which has been around nationally for more than a decade, but also state renewable portfolio standards for renewable energy. I would emphasize that energy and land use and impacts on biodiversity have always gone hand in hand. I started my legal career 40 years ago as a coal mine regulator in the Interior Department, and I think about the energy that we get from coal, and we had impacts of the mines themselves. Even if reclaimed, the biodiversity on those mine sites is far diminished over what it typically had been. The railroad lines bringing the coal to power plants, the power plants themselves, the coal ash disposal areas. So we have the same for our oil and natural gas, the drilling, development, pipeline networks, and distribution networks. So renewable energy presents some different challenges. How do we deal with siting and management of utility scale wind farms or utility scale solar arrays? Or can we deal with things that are smaller than utility scale distributed energy sources? But every source of energy that we have will present a set of potential conflicts and a set of potential opportunities. And to help us with these, we have a wonderful panel today. Our panel of experts is into both the conservation and the renewable energy side of our discussion. And we're going to start with, as we should, our conservation biologist representative. We have two lawyers and a conservation biologist. So let's start with the conservation biologist, Patrick Donnelly, who is the Nevada State Director of the Center for Biological Diversity. Graduated UC Berkeley. He has deep experience on Western lands, both at CBD and also spending a great deal of time leading expeditions and working in the American West. Patrick is going to deal to some substantial degree with some of the federal issues and the terrestrial issues, land-based species that are implicated by renewable energy projects and decisions. He'll be followed by Margaret Springs, a lawyer by training. Margaret is the Chief Conservation and Science Officer at the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California, one of my favorite science places and a great place to visit. So go to the aquarium. It's just a terrific national and international educational resource. Margaret, before joining the aquarium, spent years as Chief of Staff and as Deputy Undersecretary at NOAA in Washington, D.C., the Obama administration. He's also worked for the Nature Conservancy in California, looking at marine and coastal issues, and has been a Senate staffer and a career in private practice in Washington, D.C. before that. So we're delighted to have Margaret on our panel, and Margaret's going to focus to some degree on state-related goals and issues, and particularly given her place at the aquarium, looking at some of the trade-offs and opportunities for marine protected area conservation. Really important set of concerns there. Our third panelist is Priya Gandhir with the Center for the Conservation Law Foundation based in Massachusetts. And Priya's work focuses primarily on renewable energy and clean energy opportunities. She has done work on both offshore wind and on energy policy at the state and local level, and has also served as a local government official. And so Priya will give us the opportunity to look at some of those, both terrestrial and marine issues, some utility regulation issues, and some of the local government contributions to some of these issues that we have. So we're delighted to have all of these panelists. We'll spend about 15 to 18 minutes with each of them. I urge you to submit your questions in writing throughout, and we'll circle back to those, but I'll turn it over right now to Patrick.
Thank you, Jim. Happy to be here today. I'm Patrick Donnelly with the Center for Biological Diversity. I use he, him pronouns, and I come to you today from the lands of the Southern Paiute here in Southern Nevada in the Mojave Desert. And we'll go to our first slide. I'm happy to talk with you today about renewable energy in the California and Nevada deserts. And we'll highlight some of the impacts of renewable energy to public lands and endangered species, and then talk a little bit about how planning can avoid those impacts and facilitate a more rapid and environmentally sensitive deployment of renewable energy resources in our transition. The Center for Biological Diversity is a nationwide 50c3 nonprofit. We're headquartered in Tucson, Arizona, but we operate in every state in the union, as well as Mexico, and engaging with the international community as well. We fight for endangered species and public lands, but we also have programs in environmental health, our Climate Law Institute, sustainability and population, urban wildlands, and other programs. And I'm not an attorney, although I work with many attorneys. We have, I think, 60 attorneys at last count, and certainly we're known for our environmental litigation, some of which we'll discuss today. So we'll go to, well, on this slide, this is really the take-home message from renewable energy development. There's no such thing as a free lunch. The desert is an incredibly biodiverse place. In addition to being my home, it's a very special and unique ecosystem globally, the desert southwest of the United States. And it's rich in biodiversity. This place featured in the background photo here is a place called Chicago Valley, which is just outside my back door here in southern Nevada, and it is full of desert tortoises, desert bighorn sheep, and other important species, and was the site of a proposed solar development. And you know, we support solar energy development. We have a team that spends all day, every day, fighting the fossil fuel industry and supporting renewable energy. But this was the wrong place, and we fought solar energy development here, and we won. And Chicago Valley is now protected forever from inappropriate development. And that's, you know, one of the times this has come up. Next slide, please. So large-scale solar typically is 5 to 10 acres per megawatt, so it's a significant allocation of land. Frequently, because the Mojave Desert has the greatest solar resource in the country, these projects are sited in desert tortoise habitat. The desert tortoise is a landscape-scale endangered species in the Mojave Desert, and its conservation has really driven land use policy and management in the Mojave for the 31 years now that it's been protected under the Endangered Species Act. And there have been really significant issues with the desert tortoise and utility-scale solar development, issues with inadequate consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which has precipitated numerous Endangered Species Act lawsuits. And you know, an example of that is you think there's 100 tortoises on the site, and you go out, you start clearing the tortoises out to build your solar project, and it turns out there's 1,000. And these animals do not survive translocation well, and they don't succeed in reproduction. And so these projects have had a really significant impact on a protected species. Now, there have been improvements over time. That acres per megawatt has come down as solar panels have become more efficient. Modern projects are not graded anymore. It used to be they would bulldoze the entire project flat and cover it in gravel with herbicides to keep down the weeds. And now projects tend to be mowed. The topography is left intact. And, you know, theoretically, if the project is decommissioned, it will more readily return to the desert and high quality habitat. There's also been an evolution on the type of technology. The solar thermal technology that you see depicted here is no longer in fashion. This was a type of technology where mirrors, not solar panels, but just mirrors, would reflect sunlight onto a central power tower, heating up a thermal exchange medium like molten salts or water or pentane to power a turbine. These projects were very speculative. They also required quite a lot of water. This project here, depicted here, is called Ivanpah Solar Energy Generating Station. It's on the California-Nevada border south of Las Vegas. And it was kind of an icon for the problems with these projects. There were many hundreds of tortoises on this site. The Ivanpah Valley is an important tortoise habitat reserve for connectivity across the tortoises range. And Ivanpah was really a focus of controversy in the early days of utility scale solar development. This was really about 10, 11 years ago. And some of the lessons learned from Ivanpah hopefully helped inform future development. We can go to the next slide. Well, one of the biggest problems with Ivanpah was how it proliferated more development in the area. So Ivanpah, you can see on the far left of this aerial photograph, of the satellite photograph, the 3 power towers are visible there on the left. Well, there's also, you know, a half dozen solar photovoltaic projects that kind of metastasized across the valley here. And, you know, the Ivanpah Valley was not the right place to put these projects. It was important tortoise habitat. But due to poor planning, these projects were kind of thrown in willy-nilly in this valley. And there could be significant impacts on the long-term viability of the desert tortoise vis-a-vis migration, particularly with regard to climate. Species are projected to migrate poleward during the scenarios of climate change. And this is essentially a pinch point in that northward migration that has now been filled with industrial development. So it's a good example of poor planning leading to poor outcomes. I think another example is our next slide, the Battleborn project, which was proposed in a place called Lower Mormon Mesa. This is northeast of Las Vegas. And the Battleborn project was sited right next to the community of Overton and Logandale. Lower Mormon Mesa is a popular recreation area. And there's also some landscape art out there. The famous Michael Heiser's Double Negative is out there. And it's high quality tortoise habitat. Now, the people there really got up in arms, and you can see from their protest here. You know, they tend to be red voters out there in Logandale and Overton, and there was this kind of reputation that a bunch of Trump voters who like to drive their ATVs killed a renewable energy project because they hate solar, and that really wasn't the case. This was high quality tortoise habitat. This was an important place to a community, regardless of who they vote for. And you know, I like to say that everyone's a NIMBY when it's their own backyard. And so we can't just dismiss the idea that people don't want industrial development right next to their houses. Because think about how you'd feel if it was your house. Next slide, please. And it's not just solar that has impacts on biodiversity. Geothermal energy is also a significant source of conflict, especially in Nevada, which has the highest incidence of hot springs in the United States. Hot springs belie a geothermal reservoir. Hot spring is nothing more than a geothermal reservoir being brought to the surface by faulting. And hot springs are oases of biodiversity. The Great Basin is a cold desert. It gets extremely cold in the winter, and cold water springs will freeze over. But hot springs do not freeze over. And as a result, they harbor numerous species that won't grow elsewhere in the desert. Geothermal energy sited next to hot springs has been found through extensive documentation and peer-reviewed study to almost universally affect the springs it is sited next to. Through all the pumping of water, recirculation through the aquifers, it can really affect those resources. And the USGS said it should be considered the rule rather than the exception that geothermal energy will impact nearby superficial water sources. So in Nevada, we have a case study of that with the Dixie Valley toad. So this little toad here was identified as a distinct taxon of toad about 5 years ago at Dixie Valley. Nevada is still a biological frontier to the kind of Western sciences anyway, and there are still species being described. This species was described from a place called Dixie Meadows, where a hot spring keeps open water through the winter and the toad can survive. Well, Dixie Meadows is also the site of a proposed geothermal energy development, the Dixie Meadows Geothermal Utilization Project. And if you want to see how close it is to the habitat, you can see this is Dixie Meadows, the habitat of the toad right here. And on the back left, kind of just below where the mountain meets the flatter ground, you can see two piles of dirt. And that is the staging area for the geothermal project. So it is right next to this meadow that protects this species. So we petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect the Dixie Valley toad under the Endangered Species Act in 2017, right around the time this project was started permitting. And we got a positive 90-day finding, which is the first step to Endangered Species Act protection in 2018. However, the Fish and Wildlife Service delayed the 12-month finding, the final step. And so we had to sue over that in 2019 due to those delays from the service. And that litigation was wrapped up with a number of other blown deadlines that the service had for other species. So we're still in settlement discussions on that. But the geothermal project proceeds apace. And we have word that BLM may permit it, the Bureau of Land Management may permit it any day now, in which case we are strongly considering moving for a preliminary injunction to stop the construction. As the scientists say, without a doubt, the geothermal project puts these species at risk of extinction. Next slide. Lithium production is also something that's very much on our radar. All this renewable energy needs to be stored somehow, and lithium is currently the best technology for energy storage. Large-scale battery storage, right now needs lithium. Now, that could change in the future, but there's kind of an acute need for lithium right now, also for electric vehicles. I want to get to the end of my presentation, so I'm going to go quickly through this, but there are two projects in Nevada that have really been the center of a lot of controversy. Next slide. One is the Rhyolite Ridge mine. Rhyolite Ridge is in Esmeralda County, Nevada, and it is the site of a plant. This is Team's buckwheat here, which is endemic to soils that are rich in lithium. So this wildflower is adapted to lithium-rich soils, has the unfortunate distinction of being adapted to lithium-rich soils. It grows only on 10 acres at the site of this mine. And if the mine were built out, it would drive this species to extinction. The plan is for this plant to be at the bottom of an open pit mine. So we have petitioned this species for Endangered Species Act protection and filed numerous lawsuits to try to stop the construction of this mine. Next slide. There's another lithium mine up in northern Nevada, the Oregon border, Thacker Pass, which has engendered significant citizen opposition, particularly due to the impacts to the traditional homelands of the Fort McDermott Paiute tribe. And the tribal interests have rallied in opposition to that mine. Next slide, please. So what to do? We need renewable energy desperately. And the environmental impacts cannot be eliminated. There's no such thing as a free lunch, but they can be minimized. So first, we need to focus on distributed resources. There is no reason we can't have a solar panel on every rooftop in this country. And really the only obstacle to that is the investor-owned utility model of energy production, which is a whole other presentation. But the IOUs is what is preventing that from being our significant. But the second and most important way we can minimize these impacts is through large-scale geospatial planning. So looking at the desert as a whole and figuring out where the best places to deploy these technologies are, which will minimize environmental impact. Next slide. So the best example of this is in California, and it's called the Desert Renewable Energy and Conservation Plan, the DRECP. And it basically took a look at the entire California desert, so it's a 25 million acre area, to see where are the best places, the optimal places to site utility scale solar development while minimizing environmental impacts. This is a map of the very southeast corner of the California desert. The pink areas are what are called development focus areas. They are places where solar energy development was allocated for intensive use through the DRECP. Meanwhile, the blue crosshatched areas, and I realize this is kind of a muddy map here, but you can see the blue crosshatched areas, those were areas allocated for conservation. So it was sort of a mitigation. You know, we're going to develop these areas for utility scale solar. They're functionally sacrifice zones for energy. But in exchange, we're going to save all this other land under permanent conservation. And so it was seen, you know, nobody was entirely happy with it. I mean, there's some really nice desert out there in those pink areas, places people love dearly. But no one sued over the DRECP. And if you want an example of something that probably struck the right balance, it's a plan that no one litigated. Because if nothing else, the scene of renewable energy has been a scene of extensive litigation. So the DRECP is generally seen as a success and generally seen as a model to be deployed in other places. Next slide. So there's a number of ways that planning can minimize environmental impacts. In lithium production, there are sustainable technologies for lithium, so-called DLE, direct lithium extraction, uses physical, chemical, or electrical methods to extract lithium from underwater brines, underground brines. So lithium-rich groundwater brines. And direct lithium extraction takes out the lithium and re-injects the brines. It's water neutral, and it's seen as a promising technology for large-scale lithium extraction. Large-scale solar, we need geospatial planning. We need higher panel efficiencies on these projects. And there's other best practices that can be deployed, like mowing, to make these mandatory. And with geothermal energy, there are many, many places to develop geothermal that don't have endangered species right next to them. Why don't we prioritize those areas? Next slide. And why do we need this? Because we need renewable energy desperately. We fight every day for renewable energy. Planning will minimize the environmental impacts. And minimizing those impacts will then avoid litigation and conflict, as we saw in California. And what does that mean? That means more and faster renewable energy deployment. Projects we litigate get tied up for years and years. And you know, we really don't have years and years. We don't have that luxury. So we need this planning in order to facilitate this transition as rapidly as possible. Next slide. I think that's all I had for today. This is a baby desert tortoise, just to leave you with the emblem of why the desert is such a special place and why you know, the tortoise needs our help as well as the climate. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you for covering a great deal of ground in a short bit of time. I encourage our attendees to post questions in the question box or chat if you can't find the question box for Patrick, even as we move ahead with our additional presentation. So we'll turn from the California desert to a little further west in California, Margaret Spring.
Thank you, Jim. Well, yes, I'm Margaret Spring. I'm the Chief Conservation and Science Officer at the aquarium here. Beautiful Monterey, as you suggested. It's an amazing place. I spent many years in another place called Washington, D.C., and I have to say, this was a great trade. But anyway, just to remind, for those of you who don't know, the Monterey Bay Aquarium's mission is to inspire conservation of the ocean. And today, I'm going to talk about really one aspect of renewable energy and the potential conflict with biodiversity, or more likely, hopefully, solutions. As we've just heard, there's a possibility that this could work in the ocean. So the use of the establishment of offshore renewables, especially wind here in California, is active. And so, you know, the aquarium's a trusted science-based voice with wide public engagement. People turn to us for information. We have a lot of expertise too, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, plastic pollution, ecosystem health, and of course our southern sea otter, which everybody loves to watch on our cams. We're also closely tracking offshore wind and the momentum towards protecting nature under a couple of EOs, because we were also very engaged in the establishment of the network of marine protected areas here in California. And we and our science partner, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, do research right here all up and on the coast. We work with partners, so we're very much wanting to be on top of what's happening. So I'm coming at this to you as an entity that is trying to translate and help people be part of the decision making and make sure all the information is in place. Next slide. So I know that this whole panel is trying to answer the question, but I'll restate it. How do you advance both the renewable goals, you know, President Biden's target of employing tens of thousands of workers a day and workers to deploy 630 gigawatts of renewable offshore wind power by 2030, and protecting nature, preserving biodiversity at the local and global scales? That's a big question, and so we are hoping to see if we can get there next. This is an example of one of the most beautiful areas off of our coast, which is our kelp forest, but this is actually within our kelp forest in the aquarium, which I encourage you to visit. But it's just an amazing and vibrant place that we want to protect. Next. Okay. So there's the biodiversity and climate change. Oh, can you go to the next slide? The biodiversity and climate change are twin environmental crises, and we really have to deal with them. We can't avoid them. The climate crisis is here. Oh, I'm sorry. I think you skipped too far. Did we go too far? Can you go back? Yeah, there we go. And so we have to act or else there'll be implications for ecosystems, biodiversity, ocean functions, as well as people. And we really do need to preserve biodiversity at both a global and a local scale. And so that's why, of course, the aquarium, which is a rather place-based organization, is keeping an eye on this and trying to help. So why California? Why is this a place to watch? Well, the state of California has ambitious and meaningful renewables goals, and political and public support for renewable energy here, and it's strong. We actually even have these mandates that get us to 100% renewables by 2045, which is a very aggressive target. And we also have simultaneously a strong commitment to ocean conservation and lessons learned on the process and outreach that we've done in the past that can inform the offshore wind planning process. And I also want to point out the ocean. The ocean has its special challenges and a special role. The resilient ocean plays a really important role in managing carbon. A healthy ocean is part of a climate solution. So, but we also have to make sure that we're mitigating emissions. And so we're supportive of trying to figure out how to have offshore wind in our ocean environment as a solution. Of course, the renewables come with some impacts on ocean users, which are top of mind, but of course also pose risks to marine wildlife and the ecosystem. So there's some careful attention needed. And so the ocean constituency is quite different from the land-based constituency. And it's a new area for attention. Climate change itself is changing the environment while we're trying to cite these things. So we have sharks moving northward, kelp declining, warming sea temperatures. So baseline data and monitoring for change unrelated to the development and outside of management areas is going to be important. And so that's a huge consideration. And finally, inequity. There's a third crisis. It's inequity. It's called out in the EOs that we'll be talking about. And this includes the legacy and harm of inequitable access to the outdoors, whether that's America's special landscapes and seascapes or communities, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, not having green space in their neighborhood. So I thought we'd go to the next slide, which should be our otter. Yes, what's happening in California now? Well, driven by the desire to fight climate change and loss of biodiversity, for now, we're engaged simultaneously in a number of processes that are converging in the state, which is creating a dynamic environment and a test case for how this all works. In California, we're ahead of many states on protection and renewables, but the ocean and coastal areas are really a new area, a new focus area that we haven't really spent a lot of time with, so we're learning as we're going. Next slide. So there's a number of initiatives here, and I'm going to whip through them as quickly as I can, but on the next slide, I just want to move to the next slide, please. The first thing I just want to flag is that we have a state marine protected area network, and this is maybe our first biodiversity effort here in California, and we're already coming up to a 10-year review. The establishment of this network was completed in 2012, and now the state is undergoing review of this. 16% of our state waters are already in a network of 124 MPAs. 9% are no-take or highly protected. It was a very interesting process. It was state and philanthropically funded. It took a long time, 2004 to 2012. And it focused on protections really relating to fishing uses. That was the major issue at the time. And so that has created some challenges with outreach on protected area issues with fishing communities who really had a challenging time during this process. And through a lot of lessons learned, including stakeholder process and equity. And like I said, there's a decadal review that's due at the end of 2022. So into that background, go to the next slide. We have two 30 by 30 initiatives landing in California at the same time. The first is for state waters. Governor Newsom issued an EO to combat the biodiversity and climate change crises in California using nature-based solutions. And the goals are sort of the federal and the America the Beautiful initiative, as well as the state initiative, are rather similar, high level, undefined in terms of what it will require. So there's a lot of bottom-up work that has to happen. And with respect to the ocean areas, while there's a lot of detail in the governor's EO that there's a California Biodiversity Collaborative, they're elevating the role of natural and working lands as a pillar of the climate change strategy, and there's a big equity aspect to this. California is not pursuing this process right away on ocean and coastal waters until after that first process is completed, which is the review of the existing marine protected areas in state waters, and that's due in December of 2022. At that time, the state will release its pathways. Fishermen opposition, as I suggested, was strong. Is strong to this based on the MLPA experience, the Marine Life Protection Act experience. And so equity for them is also a topic that they'll be exploring, I think, in this process. So we have outreach going on around the state on the land areas, for sure. A little bit of a pause on the coastal areas. And so I will say that we do look ahead to the definitional questions between the two initiatives just to see, what's enough, and will the MLPA areas, what will they meet in terms of the federal of the state EO. And for America the Beautiful, which is the next one that's come into place, it's actually still in a information gathering process. And the idea is to gather and put together an atlas of nature to establish a baseline and evaluate what's actually conserving what and how effective they are. And so there's a lot of things that will be this is led by NOAA out of the administration, and how many things will sort of fit into a category of protection is a process that's useful, and glad they're doing that. There are definitely major principles that are echoing many of the principles in the state effort, which is honoring tribal sovereignty, including science, creating jobs, collaboration, and inclusion. And they're also asking the public what criteria should be used to identify places that need more conservation. So this is a very bottom-up effort. Okay. One thing to know about California too, you go to the next slide. Oh, here we go. Thank you. This slide is that California federal waters are already the site of many existing federal protections. So you have the state protected areas, and then of course you've got national marine sanctuaries all up and down the coast in federal waters, which have zoning requirements of their own. And there's also a proposed sanctuary off of Morro Bay, which will be important later because that's the site of one of the call areas for offshore wind. And so we have a long history here of opposing any new offshore oil and gas development. And also we have some interesting history because the military has reserved a lot of our areas offshore for security purposes and training purposes. So there's a very challenging siting mosaic here to consider. And so we are, while all this is in the background, we're thinking, well, what'll count towards protection? Who's going to drive this process? How are the two federal and state processes going to come together or not? And how will equity be assured? All of those things, and also where's the science we need? But what's happened is that while this is sort of in play, you have a very active offshore wind proposal process coming at us. And so this biodiversity effort is NOAA-led, but the offshore wind development process is led by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So this is going to be interesting to see how this will come together. And there's a lot of opportunity for doing this right, of course. And so we look forward to seeing that happen. Going to the next slide. Thank you. So California has really aggressive renewables targets, as I mentioned. And of course, offshore wind is seen as potentially answering some of those needs. And there's a lot of information that has to be gathered before we know exactly how much. If you go to the next slide, the enabling conditions are there. There's a lot of political interest and support for trying to have offshore wind meet our needs. The political leadership seems to be lining up on this, which is unusual and encouraging. And so the one thing to know about federal offshore wind in California is that we're having to work with a very new technology, floating wind turbines. We've never used those. The East Coast situation, they use different technology. So we're in a kind of not only an area where we don't know everything we would love to know about the environment, but we certainly don't know exactly what these wind turbines will look like. We know they'll be around 600 feet tall, which is pretty big. They'd be sited in waters that are very deep. And so the breadth and the controls around them are still under discussion. It's not really clear how big they'll be. And there's been a lot of interest in putting these out there for a long time, but finally they came out with a request for public input on 2 call areas off of California and federal waters, off of Humboldt Bay and Morro Bay. And right now there's the environmental assessment stages are sort of going on now, so there's a lot of opportunity. If you can go to the next slide, sorry, I wanted to show the maps. Yeah, that's one of the call areas we have. There's environmental analysis at the state level that's happening right now in these call areas, and people are mobilizing very quickly to move on research to inform least conflict areas. This is a concept that I think has worked on land, and I think was demonstrated by the previous slide, the previous speaker's slide of that crosshatched map. We're looking for least conflict areas to characterize, and so we're moving at double time while the leasing process is going through. The state's mobilizing. We have a couple of specific specific efforts, but also the federal government is working on this as well. And there's a lot of data synthesis tools that have been developed over time by the federal government. So we're looking forward to having those things be taken into account too. If you want to go to the next slide. Oh, let me just say something about the previous slide, excuse me. On the right-hand side is an area, there's also so just to add some excitement to the issue, we have state waters, 2 state water demonstration projects moving very quickly through the State Lands Commission decision-making process with a decision due this fall. I will say they were cited in very high biodiversity areas and generated a lot of concern. So I would say this might be the poster for what, if you don't have comprehensive planning, what happens to the collision between a biodiversity and planning for something like this. And so a lot of comments have gone into the state on that. But going to the next slide now, sorry. So there's some challenges because you see this timeline is quite aggressive. There's a rapid timeline. As yet, there's no comprehensive planning in place. We're basically building the plane while we're flying it. So the state's trying to do that with the federal government. There are multiple federal agencies that have to be involved. The state has to be commenting. And at the same time, we have this outreach on the America the Beautiful and a planning process around what do we have in place. And I'm hoping that the science comes together to inform both processes. There's a lot of user conflict and impact in particular communities that have to be dealt with in terms of outreach. Already this timeline shifted a bit, but right now BOEM is suggesting that we might be leasing these as soon as the end of next year. Very, very aggressive. But and then you know the outer limits of the deadline of the timeline are slipping probably, but certainly there are some important considerations for industry. Industry wants to get in on some tax credits. Those tax credits go into effect unless you actually start working on something before 2025. So there's movement in both directions. There's a lot of the outreach is going to take time. The science is going to take time, but there's a lot of need to have more renewables in place on certain deadlines. So in general, I will say with respect to California, there are some solutions underway. A bill was just passed to require the California Energy Commission to evaluate and quantify the maximum feasible capacity and establish a 2030 and 2045 planning goals for electricity generated by offshore wind in federal waters. So that's going to put one agency here in California really on tap to help rationalize this process. And also it's requiring state agencies to develop a strategic plan for offshore wind development in state and federal waters by mid-2023. So again, we're leasing and we're planning simultaneously. It's quite interesting. But that bill also mandates lease conflict siting, which is really important. So going to the next slide then. Basically, what you're hearing is that the responsible offshore renewable renewables to be successful are really going to be hinging on least conflict siting. The engagement of stakeholders is super important. The monitoring has got to start now, and supporting federal support for that's going to be important. And we really don't know a lot about potential impact. You know, this area is not only about because we don't know what the technology will look like, but we also know we don't know everything we would want to know about the migratory patterns and the changes that are happening. We've got whales, we've got all sorts of important migratory species here that are converging and passing through. Some of them are endangered, so there will be a lot of concern about that. And of course, birds are a major issue for lots of people, particularly with wind turbines. So that's an area that will deserve greater discussion. We joined a group of many other organizations in filing some comments to BOEM just to sort of outline, at least with respect to one area, how much information we could give them to help them make these decisions and pointing out areas of biodiversity. So this call for information is certainly going to help. And of course, you know, not having these things stovepiped, making sure people are working together towards the common goal is going to be important. And so finally, I'm going to wrap this up by saying, you know, we're sort of at the beginning, but also in the middle. And if you can go to the next slide. We have sort of like, what do we think it will take to avoid conflict between biodiversity and offshore renewables? Well, of course, you know, we are positive and a positive thinking organization. But the first thing I see, and as being a former government worker, so to speak, is government leadership, coordination, and oversight is going to be critical. We depend on that as government to be working together. And I know there's an effort afoot, which is good, but keeping that going and making sure that that the government engagement is within the state and federal and between the state and federal and tribal. There's just a lot of work to be done there. Science and monitoring are crucial, especially with climate change. We have to build trust and relationships through transparency. There's a lot of mistrust here because of some previous efforts that I think got better in the end. We made a lot of progress, but we certainly can do better. The comprehensive planning process, as has been suggested before, absolutely essential. We really need to make sure that we're really looking at the whole picture and not just taking single decisions that somehow don't add up to anything. And there are some good examples of how this has gone. And one was there was also the San Joaquin Valley least conflict solar analysis, which was a collaborative and orderly planning process that identified renewable energy development areas. You know, so I think there's the 6-month process in the Central Valley of California seems to be an interesting model that I think the state will be looking at. The ecosystem processes have got to be considered broadly. You know, you can really get tied up if you don't really have you don't have a plan that's looking far ahead. And in fisheries and in other areas, we've actually had to have multiple year programmatic approaches that incorporate ecosystem information as well as plan for future contingencies. And I think there's some models for that in both fisheries and offshore oil and gas. And so there's some, not that everything's perfect, but the government's been trying to improve its ability to have an ecosystem approach to decision making, and this administration could really help. You know, one area that this can happen is if you look at a local area, if we think of this as a local question, you know, you can bring data to the table in an area where people have decided what they want to have happen. Well, we're covered by lots of national marine sanctuaries, which are multiple use areas and their constituencies. So we did this for this National Marine Sanctuary here in Monterey, brought fishermen together to identify ways of changing the boundaries of some of the marine protected areas, and it seemed to work quite well on a local basis. So there's lots of opportunity there. And then, of course, science, research, and monitoring, I can't say that enough. The fact that we can have a decadal review of the marine protected area network is incredibly important to building confidence that management effort was done well. And if something needs to change, it can be adapted to that. And so without the monitoring that was put in place for that, we would have been unable to do a review. So that's a whirlwind trip through what's happening in California. And thank you for the time. I hope I haven't gone too far over. Appreciate it. You can go to the next slide, it's closing out.
Oh, excellent, excellent photo. Thank you, Margaret. Appreciate that quick tour of the ocean environment and the issues that are raised there. Again, I encourage our attendees to submit questions for all three of the panelists so that we can get to them when we get to the question period. And I'll turn it over now to Priya.
Hi, everybody, and good afternoon from Boston, out here on the East Coast. So I think it's morning for all you folks, but you know, that was really great. I've learned so much from Patrick and Margaret, and definitely want to echo a lot of the considerations are almost everything that you've both mentioned in terms of, what we need to consider in this balancing between fighting climate change by growing our renewable energy infrastructure while maintaining our really, vulnerable, vibrant lands and the species that inhabit them. Slide, please. Awesome. We'll just go back to the title slide. One more backwards. Yeah, there we go. So like I said, I'm out here on the East Coast. I'm live from just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. My name is Priya Gundbir, and I'm a staff attorney at Conservation Law Foundation. I use she, her pronouns, and I work entirely in CLF's Clean Energy and Climate Change program. So my work involves advocacy before the State Department of Public Utilities, as well as advocating before Independent System Operator New England, or ISO New England, which is the entity that runs New England's electric grid. CLF is a member-supported environmental advocacy organization. We have a strong history of involvement in issues relating to, like I said, utility regulation. We also use law, policy, and market mechanisms to promote a healthy, sustainable, and equitable New England for all. In addition to clean energy and climate change, our work addresses ocean conservation, clean air and water, environmental justice, healthy and resilient communities. We are, I guess, depending on your perspective, we're like a more small to medium sized organization, but we work very closely with other local groups as well as some national groups in accomplishing these goals. Slide. Okay, so here in New England, we are already starting to see the impacts of climate change on our communities, on our natural resources. Examples of this would include the more frequent and severe storms we're experiencing. These storms cause property damage, they cause economic loss, they threaten people's livelihoods. A lot of New England has coastal communities, including even Boston itself, as well as Cape Cod. Sea level rise threatens these communities, and high heat days impact public health. There's definitely been a tie made between the communities that are most vulnerable to climate change and those that were hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to climate change really impacting heat and people's health in that manner, the pollution that is caused by emission from greenhouse gases, also contributes to those consequences. And then in addition to that, changes in weather impact local fishers who depend on, a consistent crop or a consistent harvest for their livelihoods. So the Biden administration's 30 by 30 conservation goals do present an opportunity to balance environmental considerations of conserving natural resources with our need to move away from fossil fuel resources to clean, sustainable energy options. It is a little bit less so here in New England because we are obviously smaller than some of our sister states out west, where they have kind of like larger swaths of land. But in terms of offshore wind, 30 by 30 conservation goals are definitely relevant to New England. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So now you've heard from my peers out west on some considerations regarding federal and state law. So I'm going to discuss from a local perspective here in New England, and by local I mean like municipal level, how we balance the development of renewable energy infrastructure with protecting our vital resources, as well as discussing Conservation Law Foundation's work to encourage offshore wind development while protecting our ocean and coastal resources, as well as the creatures that inhabit them and the people who depend on these resources for their livelihoods. Slide. So in a quick overview, down and dirty of municipal permitting, the primary way in which municipalities regulate land use is through planning and zoning bylaws, or ordinances, depending on if you're a city. So zoning bylaws ensure that development occurs in a strategic manner. So basically, certain areas are designated for particular land uses, whether that be residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural, and some spaces are also designated to remain open, green conservation space. So most places have municipal planning and zoning laws. In Massachusetts, we actually also have a law protecting wetlands resources. That's the Commonwealth's Wetlands Protection Act, and that is administered and enforced by municipal conservation commissions for the most part, and in the few communities where there isn't a municipal conservation commission, that job is undertaken by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. So in Massachusetts, it's very important to us to protect our wetland resources. They're vital, first of all, they're vital to climate resilience in terms of their function of storing and providing a outlet for stormwater and preventing flooding, or at least absorbing some flooding as climate change continues to increase. That's even an increasingly vital resource that we have here. As Margaret talked about as well, it's also important to protect these resources for equity considerations. A lot of communities in Massachusetts are lacking in access to green spaces, and most often those communities that are lacking in that access are communities of color, are lower income communities with language barriers. Here in Massachusetts, we've actually designated or created a designation of environmental justice communities, and those are based on certain criteria, which include income, English language proficiency, minority status, and basically we're working really hard to make sure that our most vulnerable communities who are most at risk of the detrimental impacts of climate change are as protected as possible. Slide. So here in Massachusetts, some communities have zoning overlays for siting of solar energy. So as I mentioned, zoning is a tool that's used to designate certain areas for certain types of land uses. What the zoning overlay for siting of solar energy does is set standards for facilitating solar development while protecting other considerations like conservation of natural resources. In Massachusetts, Massachusetts law prevents municipalities from unreasonably regulating solar energy systems unless that regulation is needed to protect public health, safety, or welfare. But Massachusetts residents are obviously, and for good reason, concerned about the impacts of solar development on our natural resources. We do have a smaller area to work with, so it's important to protect as much as possible because we don't have a lot left. We don't have a lot to lose, or we do have a lot to lose, but we don't have a lot of space. Hopefully that made sense. We don't have a lot of space, and so taking a little bit of it, it has a big impact. So a lot of residents, like I said, are concerned about the impacts of solar development on our natural resources. This photo here accompanied a news article in the local news, which discussed clear cutting of forested land to install solar farms. Here in Massachusetts, we do have a legal mandate of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so it's vital that we figure out a way to balance growing our renewable energy infrastructure with protecting our natural lands. Solar energy is going to be a major component of meeting our legal mandate to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And if we use responsible siting measures, such as had been mentioned, rooftops or parking garages to site solar instead of clear cutting forests, we'll come that much closer to being able to achieve our goals without really having to unnecessarily jeopardize our natural resources. Slide. So now I'll transition over from solar resources to offshore wind. We don't have, I mean, I guess it depends on what you think is cute. Like otters and turtles are wicked cute, but whales are just majestic, right? So this image here is a right whale. It is a critically endangered species, which has a home in New England's oceans. So in addition to protecting our forests and our green space, New Englanders are concerned about protecting our oceanic resources. Our oceans are home to many vibrant and vital species, including the right whale, and protecting this habitat is a critical part of Conservation Law Foundation's work. Our oceans are also a very important part of our local economy. As I had mentioned earlier, we have a lot of people who are dependent on New England's natural resources for their livelihoods. So there are generations of local fishers who depend on the well-being of our marine systems for their livelihoods. And that really means that we work in a sustainable way with our oceans. So ocean resources are threatened by climate change. A lot of species are very sensitive to temperature and chemical composition of the ocean, and climate change impacts both of those. They're also very sensitive to water pollution and overfishing, as well as other hazards. So Conservation Law Foundation has a history of working in protecting our ocean resources and continues to do so. Slide. Thank you. Ooh, yeah, there we go. So, as previously noted, Massachusetts has a legal mandate to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Other New England states have established similar policies or mandates as well. And in order to meet these requirements, development of offshore wind needs to happen, and soon. Conservation Law Foundation has been working to promote development of offshore wind using law, policy, and market mechanisms. At the same time, we're working to protect our vital marine resources, such as the endangered right whale. We work closely with other environmental advocates. And in 2019, we were able to reach an agreement with the local offshore wind developer, Vineyard Wind. And this agreement protects the endangered right whale by limiting where and when wind turbines can be constructed offshore from New England. And these limitations on where and when turbines can be constructed will serve to reduce interference with whale migration, with their feeding patterns, with their reproduction, and at the same time, allow Vineyard Wind to move forward, this project will add ultimately 800 megawatts of electricity to New England, which is enough to power 400,000 homes. We're also supportive of the Biden administration's 30 by 30 conservation goals. CLF has long fought to protect certain areas of our coastal land and offshore resources by having certain areas designated as marine monuments. Unfortunately, the Trump administration had reversed some of those protections, but we hope to have those reinstated and have those areas be counted towards the 30 by 30 conservation goals. We're in favor of areas where broad conservation goals, including protection of biodiversity, count towards those goals, and want to make sure that we're preserving really quality lands or resources towards those goals. So that summarizes my perspective here. And oh, next slide. The next slide just has check out our website for like any kind of more information and how to get involved. But yeah, that summarizes our work on offshore wind and how municipal issues are dealt with here in terms of growing our renewable energy and balancing that with protecting our resources here.
Thank you, Priya. And could we go now to questions, and let's go away from the shared screen so we can actually see our panelists at full size. And again, if you haven't sent a question, please do so in the next few minutes. One question for all the panelists, and I may start actually with Patrick, but I think it applies to all, is there some role for projects that will result in a take of endangered species? Are there circumstances under which there's predicted take and that you're willing to support, and how do you make those trade-offs? And in cases where habitat conservation plans do apply, you, and I'll open this to the other panelists, do you see a role for HCPs in the renewable energy siting process? So start with Patrick.
Sure. I think with regard to the desert tortoise, and also with regard to the greater sage grouse in northern Nevada, there's proposed development there in greater sage grouse habitat. There's really no reason to site these projects in tortoise or sage grouse habitat. There's no compelling reason. There are significant areas of land that do not have desert tortoises on them and do not have any endangered species on them. Doesn't mean there's not biodiversity there, but that's a pill you could swallow. Whereas with the tortoise, frankly, 3 decades of HCPs have overseen a catastrophic decline in tortoise populations and habitat loss. So I would say the HCPs are not working as intended for the desert tortoise. So again, I think with planning and analysis, it would reveal that we really, another factor we haven't even discussed is degraded lands. EPA's Repower initiative found that there were literally 1 million acres in Nevada of degraded lands, abandoned mine lands, etc., where you could site these projects. And those lands definitely do not have endangered species on them. So, I think there's so many possibilities out there for siting that we don't need to accept significant impacts to endangered species anymore.
So you stake that out pretty strongly, at least with respect to the desert environments. Margaret, do you want to comment?
Wow, we're very early in this process, but I'm in line with Patrick's comments, just in that least conflict siting is really a process been endorsed by the state, and we would look to the state and the federal government to assess the impact to endangered species, and certainly we'll bring that to the table. But I think we'd be getting ahead of ourselves to say anything like that. And I do feel like we're in the ocean in particular, we're going to be in a state of lack of knowledge or imperfect knowledge, precautionary approaches. So, and of course, we're hoping for mitigation and learning and adaptation. So I'm going to keep positive on it, just like Patrick. But I would think that the protection of endangered species is a responsibility of the federal government, and I think that they have a heavy burden to allow a take, and particularly if they're very, very endangered. We certainly have a threatened sea otter, who's, I would say, is there are takes, but they're largely natural takes. It's not, we're not inflicting this upon them, and it's something that we have to take very seriously.
Priya, did you want to add anything on this particular topic?
I would just make note, I think that it's a little bit harder here. I mean, I would certainly love to be able to take the position of like being very aggressive, but here in New England, where we have a lot less space, it does become a more of like a tightrope scenario where we are balancing the fact that we do have a need to really quickly and aggressively grow our renewable energy infrastructure, with the fact that there is limited space. But with careful planning, you know, there's no need to be reckless or unnecessarily jeopardize our really vital resources. I agree on that.
Yeah, appreciate those perspectives. I do more work on the terrestrial side in some places where there are a great many listed species, or at least putative listed species in some areas. And I wonder, Patrick, is your answer at all different in places like southern, parts of Southern California, not in the desert environment, or in the east, and maybe not. Maybe it's we can always avoid takes if we look hard enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think I come from a pretty singular geographic perspective. Being in the Mojave Desert, being responsible in my job for Nevada in particular. And the tortoise is declining for a whole variety of reasons, most of which are completely unrelated to renewable. Certainly the concept of the HCP is not inherently flawed and has been successful in many places around the Western United States. I think the Mojave Desert is seen as a singular resource for solar. It has the highest solar installation rates of any place in the country. And Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger very famously said at the opening of that Ivanpah facility I showed earlier, if you can't put a solar project in the Mojave Desert, I don't know where the hell you can put it. In many ways that represented an early perspective here, which is, well, the desert's just empty anyway. Who cares? It's just the desert. I think the ensuing decade and a half of controversy out here has really shown that actually deserts are full of life, and in some cases very vulnerable life. And so, I think the Mojave Desert definitely has a role to play in the renewable energy future, but it's about that proper siting and avoiding it.
Thanks, I appreciate it. A question about NEPA review. There's been some stories in the trade press recently about, is the Biden and other renewable energy agendas running into NEPA, and aren't they going to end up hating NEPA just as much as the fossil fuel industry came to over time? And what is the panel's perspective in how, if at all, is NEPA an obstacle or opportunity with respect to these objectives in the areas where you work? And maybe I'll start with Margaret, if that's all right.
Sure. I think of NEPA as a tool. And I think it can be used in a way that would help you make trade-off decisions around alternatives, if the alternatives are teed up with the right information. And so I think that when I talked about a programmatic approach, certainly we had that issue at NOAA, where we had decisions we had to make in a timely basis, but also meet NEPA timelines and stakeholder input and evaluations. And the programmatic approach was one way of framing that conversation where you sort of put everything in a box, and NEPA helped you summarize where you were. I'm not saying it's simple because you also have consistency review and other issues, but there was an attempt to I wouldn't say streamline, but rationalize the use of this tool to help you get to the end, because it is designed to help you do exactly what we're talking about, which is figuring out where the impacts might be, what options and mitigations there are. That doesn't mean it can't be frustrating. And so I do think that if the federal agencies and the state agencies come together on a way to do programmatic approaches over time, that serves as a format for adaptation and revisiting. So, and there may be some other examples in other industries. I know on land there have been NEPA reviews have been quite challenging. However, I think there have been some efforts to make it work for helping you make decisions. And in fact, in every administration, there's been an effort to try and figure out how to do it better. So they'll be calling on you, Jim, I'm sure.
All right, I'll give the next question to Priya, and that is, Patrick mentioned investor-owned utilities as an obstacle to distributed energy as an approach, and is that something you also see in New England, or is the situation different in the area where you work?
Yeah, it's definitely also an issue here. The hope is that our climate mandates of achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century will be a factor in stimulating change in that regard. We're also working here in Massachusetts. There's an open docket at the Department of Public Utilities, which is an investigation that was requested by the Attorney General's office into the future of gas. I know California has a similar proceeding, and I believe New York does as well. So basically working towards figuring out what the future of the gas industry here is going to look like. There's, once again, a balance. There are a lot of people in New England who depend on that industry for jobs and their economic well-being. So there is, that consideration that we have to make sure that people are able to find new opportunities as we move away from consumption of fossil fuel resources. So yeah, investor-owned utilities is definitely a barrier to, or a hurdle to our achievement of our climate goals as well. But we're working through it.
Patrick, since this teed off of your observation, and I know you didn't want to open the whole topic, but do you have anything to add or observations about the distributed energy point that you want our audience to get?
Yeah, and California's actually done fairly well at promoting distributed generation, although a major issue is that DG does not count toward the state's RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is, kind of a disincentive in and of itself for institutional support for the policy. But in Nevada, our state utility, the NV Energy, which is a Warren Buffett company, it's a Berkshire Hathaway Energy, they have fought tooth and nail against a rooftop solar, including convincing the PUC in 2015 to end all state subsidies and state requirements for rooftop, effectively killing the program. Now it was restored by the legislature 2 years later, and the legislature has since taken some action to promote renewables, but NV Energy, and especially through, to be perfectly honest, their political influence and campaign donations, has retained the favor of politicians And politicians have made many decisions to incentivize large-scale development and disincentivize community solar and rooftop, you know, from our perspective, largely at the behest of the utility. Because utilities don't make money off solar panels on your roof. And so they do not have an incentive to help you put solar panels on your roof. So we've really seen that play out in a pretty significant fashion here.
So a question dealing with sort of the flip side of this, difficulty citing utility scale, commercial scale renewables. Priya, in parts of the Northeast and parts of the country, the siting is primarily up to, you know, local governments, counties or townships or cities or the like. And you know, you see any way of dealing with the renewable energy in the context of places where it's an intensely local regulatory scheme as opposed to a state siting board or those kinds of approaches?
Yeah, it's definitely so. Fortunately, a lot of New Englanders are very concerned about the impacts of climate change. So growing our renewable energy infrastructure is supported by New England residents and at the municipal level by the people who are making decisions. A lot of, I guess a lot of the area where there would be controversy or difficulty is in the context of NIMBYism. People, you know, want to preserve and protect their natural resources, which they should want. But typically the people who are able to attend like municipal hearings are, you know, retired white people who have time in the evenings, whereas people in our environmental justice communities are, you know, oftentimes like working 2 jobs or have to send their babysitter home. Or have a language barrier to being able to participate in public process. So there are a couple of proceedings at the state level here, which would help to open up public process, make it more transparent, make it more accessible from the state level. And we're also, you know, trying to work with communities and different organizations that work with municipal boards and agencies to help make the municipal process more open and transparent as well.
Question about the role of the military. There's I think a number of you mentioned, Margaret, you know, least conflict siting, and you know the amount of airspace that's used for training purposes. And you know, I know in the East, offshore wind, there's been a lot of issues in terms of, you know, naval and radar you know, installations and the like. And in the desert, of course, there's a lot of issues as well. So, you know, is there a role for, you know, the military, which we look for almost every like function in you know, U.S. federal policy, to, you know, to promote on the conservation side or to deal with the renewable energy issue in some meaningful way? Do you have any of you have experiences that kind of speak to where that might work or could work? I don't know, I'll start with Margaret if that's okay.
So the Department of Defense wields a lot of power in siting discussions. Always have, probably always will. And in fact, we'll see how this multi-agency presidential priority and the defense control of the dialogue will mesh. I don't know. But in general, security issues are usually the trump card in just negotiations. We've had this come up in the context of some efforts to do protected areas. You know, this happens a lot. And in California, a lot of this area is in Southern California, and this is where huge areas are used for around the Channel Islands, Vandenberg, and in fact, I don't know how it'll go. I do think that the strong interest of the groups here is that DoD not be the sole decider, nor DOI. In fact, I think there should be a balanced portfolio of information that comes to bear, and trade-offs should be addressed. Is that realistic? Am I Pollyanna? Maybe Patrick can say something about the desert experience, but I don't underestimate the concern about defense operations in our waters.
Patrick?
DoD owns or manages, of course, a large amount of desert in both California and Nevada. They've generally been extremely resistant to renewable energy, even being built on the border of DoD facilities. They certainly don't want it on their land because they claim it interferes with aerial training and operations. So I don't see DoD as having much of a role in the deserts. Perhaps they could be less intransigent about opposing it outside of their facilities. But I think that's probably the only role I see.
Appreciate each of those perspectives. I don't know if we have time for. Let me see if I have any other. I think I've gotten to everything that we have in terms of questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Molly to take us out. But thank you to each of you panelists. I feel like I've learned a great deal about areas of this whole renewable energy, biodiversity conservation issue that I thought I knew pretty well, but it turns out there's a lot more to learn. So thanks to all of you. And Molly, please take us out.
Yes, and I just wanted to thank you, Jim, for a wonderful moderation of this program, and also to Patrick, Margaret, and Priya for really touching upon all the different areas within this topic. It was so interesting, and I'm sure our emerging leaders agree. And thank you to our emerging leaders for joining us today for this program, and be sure to keep a lookout for our September newsletter. All right, thank you all. Have a good one.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Jim. Take care.
Thank you, Margaret, Priya.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick and Priya, too.